Films in Focus with David Sterritt is underwritten by The Movie House, your destination for first-run Hollywood and independent movies, and a digital portal to the Met Opera, National Theatre Live, and special events worldwide in Millerton, New York, and on the web, themoviehouse.net.
David Sterritt is the editor-in-chief of the Quarterly Review of Film and Video, contributing writer at Cineast, film professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, Robin Hood Radio's very own critic. I'm becoming more and more possessive. He joins us weekly. The films are The Invisible Man, The Call of the Wild, and The Burnt Orange Heresy. How is the film critic today, David?
The film critic is really ready to get the show on the road. You're right. I have come up with a theme again, a profound one. 3 movies with "the" in the title.
Or a "the me."
Well, one of them has 2 "thes" in the title, but we'll get to that one in a little while. Let's begin with The Invisible Man, which is about an invisible man. The Invisible Man, I have to say at the outset, has virtually nothing. Yes, there is an invisible man in it, but aside from that, virtually nothing in common with the great H.G. Wells novel, which I've recently reread, and which is really not that great. But, you know, it's a good action story about an invisible man. And it has virtually nothing in common with the great old early 1930s classic adaptation of that novel by the great director James Whale. It has nothing in common with these other invisible men, or invisible persons, as I guess we might say nowadays. The Invisible Man is a completely new story. The movie was written and directed by Lee Whannell, who has come up with a completely new story. And the main character is a woman, which is part of the movie's interest. But again, it is just a whole new Invisible Man story. So what happens in this new Invisible Man that we have right now? And I'll say at the outset, by the way, it's a pretty harrowing movie and a fairly violent movie, but it's a very good sci-fi horror movie. It starts out with a woman who escapes basically from a house which is very closely guarded with all kinds of video stuff. She's got to disarm video cameras and shut off video systems and this and that. Clearly, she is being kept some sort of a prisoner in this house. And the very, very beginning of the movie is a really good just suspense sequence, escape sequence, where the woman escapes from this house. And she does make it. That's hardly a spoiler. All this is the first few minutes of the movie. But that's what happens at the beginning. And I thought, my goodness, this film is really getting started with a very strong action suspense sequence that completely engrossed me. Then when she is away from this, she goes to stay with some people who are going to keep her safe. And little by little, the backstory is filled in. We find out who she was escaping from and why she was in that house and so forth and so on. And we find out the various troubles in her life. And then she starts to get the idea that maybe she is being somehow watched, that maybe the person she escaped from is not completely out of her life. And we also start to find out that this person was a tech genius who was engaged in the field of optics. And yes, it turns out that her suspicions that there is somebody in the room with her, even though there appears to be nobody in the room with her, that those suspicions are in fact true, that this person has found a way of making himself invisible, and he is now bent on making her life miserable and horrible and dangerous and full of suffering. And that is what the movie is about. Other characters come in. There is a brother of the Invisible Man, who turns out to be a very important character in the film. There are the 2 people who the young woman, whose name is Cecilia, I haven't mentioned that, whose name is Cecilia, who she is living with. And there is her own sister. And all of these characters become important, and the movie proceeds on its pretty harrowing way. Now, I have to say that The Invisible Man is a really good science fiction horror movie. Science fiction and horror are very neighboring genres. And yes, it's science fiction because it's about a person who figures out how through science he can make himself invisible. But it's also horror because it's full of all kinds of horrific stuff that goes on. So it's a very good example of that. It's also, though, a very good acting movie. Now, here's something else I haven't mentioned. Elizabeth Moss, who is in a lot of stuff these days, and I think this is probably the best she's been since her days on Mad Men. She's a good actress. She's not one of my favorites, but she's very good, and she's very strong in the Invisible Man. And it's a very strong physical performance because she has to do all kinds of very physical stuff, but it's also a good emotional performance. She's really good. She's just fine. Her sister is well played by Harriet Dyer, and I'll single out one more person, which is Aldous Hodge, who was in the very recent, very serious movie Clemency. He is the young African-American man, and also his younger sister, played by Storm Reed, with whom she goes and stays and gets some refuge after she makes her escape at the beginning of the movie, and they are also very, very good. So The Invisible Man is a terrific movie, one that you should not miss if you are into science fiction horror movies. However, if you don't want to see a movie that's pretty violent and puts a woman into a whole lot of very harrowing situations, then it's maybe one to stay away from. I will say, though, that the movie does have really kind of a feminist twist, because our main character, the Elizabeth Moss character, is a very strong woman. And she ultimately manages to triumph over all kinds of adversity. And it's always good to see that. We still don't have enough movies where there is a very strong woman as the central character. And here she is, a strong woman who emerges triumphant at the end. And again, it's just always nice to see that. And Elizabeth Moss is very good at playing that character. Our second movie for this week, Jill, is The Call of the Wild. And yes, this is based on the novel by Jack London. Now, you and I are dog lovers, Jill. We really are. And I have to say right now that this movie is very, very much about a dog. The dog is the main character of the movie. Yes, Harrison Ford is the nominal star, but he is sort of second fiddle to the dog. And the dog is one of these sort of semi-animated dogs. It's not a real dog. It looks pretty real. I have to say it doesn't look very, very real. And that's sort of a stumbling block in the movie, is that this dog is just the acting of this dog is just a little bit too perfect. It's not real acting. It's not real dog acting. It's not a real dog. But it's a pretty convincing simulacrum of a dog, a reasonable facsimile, as they say. And if you can get into accepting this artificial dog as being a real dog, surrounded, of course, by real human characters, then you'll have a pretty good time at the movie. The other thing, though, to bring out right away, and you will appreciate this, Jill, because you are a dog lover, as am I, is that the Jack London novel that this is based on is pretty brutal. The dog at the very beginning, well, let's say in the early stages of the novel, has to contend with a very, 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 more than one very, very rough man with a club who is going to club our dog into submission, and also other dogs. There are fights among the dogs. The law of club and fang is the way that Jack London refers to the trials that our main dog, whose name is Buck, has to face. So you have to be ready for that going into the movie, The Call of the Wild. Now, The Call of the Wild is a PG movie, and it really tones down the novel. The novel is very powerful. I think it's a very, very good novel. But again, it's pretty brutal in the things that happen to our main character, the dog Buck, who, by the way, is a great big Saint Bernard. So he requires a lot of clubbing to bring him into some sort of discipline early in the movie. Early in the story. The film tones that down a bit, but it still has some pretty rough moments. And I wouldn't want to bring a very young child to this movie, even though it's not a real dog these things are happening to. It's got some pretty rough-looking stuff in it. As for the movie as a whole, I have to say that I was really won over by it very, very early on. It is not a sophisticated movie. It's corny in a lot of ways. Even though it has all of that kind of cruelty in it, it also has some real sentimentality in it. And by the end of the movie, I was practically shedding a tear over some of the sweet things that happen. It's about a dog that ultimately does answer the call of the wild up in Alaska, in the Klondike, in the Yukon, and finally comes into his destiny up there in those very wild parts of the world. But I just really was won over by it. I have to mention that the Harrison Ford, by the way, gives a very, very fine performance. But the real and the movie, I have to say, also is very well directed by Chris Sanders, whose main background is in animation, by the way. The Call of the Wild is almost entirely a live-action movie, except for that animated dog, which looks pretty much like a real dog. It certainly does not look like an old-fashioned 2D animation. But the main star of the movie is Janusz Kaminski, the cinematographer. Kaminsky has done a great deal of work with Steven Spielberg over the years, and Steven Spielberg makes these movies which are always, even if they seem to take place in the real world, always have this sort of fantastical quality to them. And The Call of the Wild has a very fantastical quality to it, even though it's set around the turn of the 20th century, and even though it deals with all sorts of supposedly very realistic things. Buck passes through the lives of more than one owner, more than one master. It has all different kinds of adventures along the way, meets all kinds of other dogs, meets all kinds of other humans. But what sustained me throughout the entire movie was just this astonishingly beautiful cinematography. It's not very realistic cinematography. Everything always looks as pretty or as interesting or as dramatic as a picture. Everything is sort of heightened. Everything is sort of in italics, but it just won me over. I found it a beautiful movie to look at, even during some of its more brutal sequences. And by the end, I was practically shedding a tear. So I recommend The Call of the Wild to anybody who wants to see a really compelling story about a dog, even if that dog never quite manages to look 100% real. It's just a nice movie. I had a good time at it. Our third movie today, even though, yes, again, it has the word "the" at the beginning of the title, is really, really different. The Burnt Orange Heresy. Both The Invisible Man and The Call of the Wild are, in their own ways, fantasies. The Burnt Orange Heresy is kind of a fantasy, too, but it's a fantasy set in the real world. It's really a drama. It was directed by Giuseppe Capotondi, an Italian filmmaker who, around 10 or 11 years ago, made a really good suspense movie called The Double Hour. Unfortunately, The Burnt Orange Heresy is not that good, but he's a director who does have some talent. The main thing I want to mention about The Burnt Orange Heresy, and I'll explain that title in a moment, is that it is a movie which has something that we don't see often enough in the movies. It has a main character, the kind of main character that everybody wants to see in the movies and somehow doesn't get to be in that many movies. The main character is a critic. Isn't that wonderful? Oh my gosh. Now, he's not a movie critic, okay, but he's the next best thing, maybe. He's an art critic. And he is an art critic who we see at the very beginning practicing his trade. He is giving a lecture to some people in a museum, and he is talking about the role of the critic. And he plays a trick on his little audience within the movie, which means he's also playing a trick on us, the audience outside the movie. And he's sort of making a point about the role of the critic. And it's a good scene, and it really gets the movie off to a great kind of a start. And even better than that is the fact that the critic himself is played by Klaus Bang, who I've just been having a great time watching in the Netflix miniseries Dracula, where Klaus Bang plays the Count, plays the vampire, and he's very good in that, and he's pretty good in The Burnt Orange Heresy, too. So anyway, we have here a movie where the main character is an art critic. And he is in Italy, even though he is not Italian, he is in Italy. And then we start to meet a couple of other people. He is hired by a mysterious billionaire, played by, now get ready for this, played by Mick Jagger, his first sort of serious movie role in a very, very, very long time. And Mick Jagger hires our critic to get into the life of a reclusive old artist, almost all of whose works have, over the years, been destroyed by fire. And the billionaire, played by Mick Jagger, wants to get a painting by this reclusive painter, and hires the critic to worm his way into the reclusive painter's life and get the reclusive painter to paint a painting, which then the billionaire can have for his very own, and it will be the only painting by that painter in the world. So that's what the story is. So I've mentioned that the critic is played by Klaus Bang. I've mentioned that the billionaire is played by Mick Jagger. The reclusive painter is played by Donald Sutherland. So these are really interesting actors, and they do a nice job for the most part. The trouble with The Burnt Orange Heresy is that once the story gets going and we have this sort of a setup, okay, our critic has to befriend the artist and get him to paint a painting, et cetera, the screenwriting is just bad. It's a movie with corny, unconvincing, overcooked dialogue that really pushed me out of the story over and over again. So that's unfortunate. What is fortunate is that it's really fun to watch Donald Sutherland, even though he has to deliver some of this awful dialogue. And it's amazing to see Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger looks, to my eye at least, at this stage of his life, one part really, really charismatic and one part really, really weird-looking and grotesque. And it's an interesting combination. And I had a wonderful time just sort of contemplating it during the relatively few moments that Mick Jagger is on the screen. Mick Jagger was sort of the Madonna of his day, a huge, gigantic, overwhelmingly important rock star who never managed to actually get a real movie career going. Well, it's not going to happen now. Mick Jagger is practically an old man. In fact, he is an old man, let's face it. But it's fun to see him in this movie. It's fun to see Donald Sutherland wrestling with a difficult script. And it's a lot of fun to see Klaus Bang playing a critic who is, not the nicest guy in the world. But hey, when it's not such a nice guy and he's a critic, we have to forgive him a lot of sins. So I would say The Burnt Orange Heresy, badly written, but still sort of fun in its own peculiar way. So that is my pretty diversified story this week, Joe.
The Diversified Story by the film critic David Sterritt. The films are The Invisible Man, The Call of the Wild, and The Burnt Orange Heresy.